everyone from Singapore, and good morning to all our friends who are joining from Europe. My name is Valentina Riccardi. I'm the director of ASEF Culture department, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone today for this webinar in partnership with UNESCO, titled Tradition in Transition: What is the way forward for the performing arts sector? I think we are going to start since we have already quite a number of people who have joined, so that we have a bit more time to explore all the three presentations today and also to have time for the Q&A afterwards. I would invite you to already make use of the chat function on our Zoom platform, and please feel free to add any comments, any question that you may have for our speakers. And then after their presentation, we will select some of the questions that will be then asked to them at the end. Before we go into the core of this presentation, I would like to briefly introduce two speakers to start. The first one is our Executive Director, ASEF Executive Director, Ambassador Stoczynska, who will give us some points to start the conversation from and some welcome remarks. So I will give the floor to you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Valentina. Thank you very much, dear speakers, dear participants. Very good afternoon. On behalf of the Asia Europe Foundation, I'm pleased to welcome you to the webinar titled Tradition in Transition: What is the way forward for the performing arts sector? I would like to start by thanking our partner, UNESCO Jakarta, the UNESCO's Regional Office for Southeast Asia, for collaborating with us on today's webinar. This session is part of UNESCO Jakarta's 2-year program, Embracing Shared Heritage Through Performing Arts, launched in July 2025 with support from the Temasek Foundation. Allow me to briefly introduce ASEF, Asia Europe Foundation, and its work in culture. Since its inception in 1997, ASEF projects in culture have promoted cultural relations by connecting cultural practitioners, art organizations, public institutions, networks, and museums in Asia and Europe. One of the long-standing projects of the foundation is Culture 360, ASEF's arts and cultural digital platform, and I would like to invite you to check out the website if you haven't already. Since its inception, Culture 360 has been exploring emerging international artistic and cultural trends through commissioned research, articles, and publications. As an information provider and knowledge platform, Culture 360 partners with other cultural organizations, networks, and institutions to organize roundtable discussion like today's webinar, to contextualize the global cultural trends and issues with experts and stakeholders from the two regions, from Asia and Europe. Today's webinar explores way forward for the performing arts sector. Across Asia and Europe, the traditional performing arts in recent decades have faced critical challenges related to knowledge transmission, relevance, and long-term sustainability. How are performing arts collectives, grassroots organizations, and institutions in Southeast Asia negotiating these challenges on a day-to-day basis? Through our 3 esteemed speakers' lectures, we will ask what are the policies and frameworks that support the sustainability and innovation of traditional performing arts. What role do intermediary institutions have in ensuring that the traditional performing arts remain a living and dynamic part of the region's cultural heritage? How may we forge new innovations across borders, networks, and disciplines, and envision a new state of play where a fair, equitable, and accessible ecosystem for the traditional performing arts becomes the norm. As we look ahead, this webinar serves as an invitation to rethink the future of the traditional performing arts sector, to center the voices of arts and cultural stakeholders in supporting living heritage, and to continue advocating for practices that align with the evolving dynamics of the social and cultural environment. I encourage you all to engage fully in today's discussions, and thank you once again for being here. I look forward to the meaningful exchanges ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Socinska, for this introduction and to set the context of today's webinar. I would like now to invite Moe Chipa, Program Specialist for Culture at UNESCO Jakarta, to say a few words and to give us maybe a bit more information on this two-year project that Ambassador Socinska mentioned earlier.
Sure.
Hi, Moe.
Hi. Selamat sore. Good afternoon, everyone. Ambassador Beata, Valentina, Kirin, and everybody from ASEF. Thank you very much for convening this very important conversation on artist working conditions, skill development, and new forms of circulation and networking. As Ambassador Beata explained, this event is part of ASEF's contribution to the UNESCO Thematic Foundation project, Embracing Shared Heritage Through Performing Arts. This project seeks to foster cross-border cooperation among performing artists across Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, because artistic creativity and appreciation naturally transcend national and political boundaries. This, we believe, is one of the inherent strengths of the arts that we must continue to nurture. And this is what the project intends to do. Beyond supporting collaboration and co-creation among artists, the project also includes a series of webinars, such as today's, where we reflect upon pressing issues in the performing arts sector, ranging from the role of contemporary creativity in sustaining traditional forms to questions of ownership and the risk of commodification, for instance. Today's webinar is particularly meaningful for us as it brings participants not only from Southeast Asia, but also from Europe. So thank you once again to ASEF for opening up this dialogue and sharing your networks and expertise to broaden our collective understanding. Now, if I may speak a little bit more personally, beyond my role at UNESCO, where we often discuss cultural policies and international frameworks, I have always been deeply moved by the arts. I'm constantly inspired by the skill, creativity, and the unexpected ways in which artists bring together elements to create something new and meaningful. So truly, the world would not be complete without the arts. And yet, in the face of what we often see as more serious global issues, like economic crisis, climate change, conflict, or food insecurity, the arts are too often considered secondary and sometimes even trivial. And this perception is reflected in reality. Culture remains one of the least funded areas of public policy. And artists are often amongst the most economically vulnerable, especially in times of crisis. Even within international discussions, including the United Nations, arts and heritage are sometimes only taken seriously when they generate economic returns. When we say we value culture, it's not always, unfortunately, matched by concrete actions or sustained support. So it is fair to ask, what is the place of the arts and of artists in today's world, especially in a time marked by uncertainty and unrest as we are living today? After all, artistic collaborations alone will not solve climate change, eliminate poverty, or end violence. And yet, I believe what the arts do offer is something fundamental. They connect people. They move us. They allow us, even briefly, to step beyond our own boundaries, national, cultural, personal, and to encounter others through curiosity and respect and affection. Traditional performing arts, in particular, carry histories, identities, and ways of understanding the world that deepen our appreciation of the communities who sustain them. These may seem like small things, but they are not. They are essential to how we relate to one another as human beings. And this is why it is so important that artists continue to exchange, collaborate, and have their work circulate across borders, and that their working conditions enable them to do so with dignity, without fear of financial insecurity or other constraints. We may not have grand solutions. Each initiative, whether this webinar or our UNESCO Temasek broader project, may seem modest in scale, but perhaps the real strength lies in the accumulation of many small, thoughtful, and responsible actions by institutions, by networks, and by each of us as individuals. In this, UNESCO sees itself as one actor among many, not as a large force within with all the answers, but as part of a collective effort to connect people, share knowledge, and provide support where we can. So once again, I'm truly delighted that we are partnering with ASEF in this shared mission to support the role of arts and culture in connecting people across borders. I very much look forward to learning from the insight and experience of our distinguished speakers this evening, and to being inspired by their perspectives on how we can continue to strengthen the performing arts sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moe. I think I couldn't have said it better, and I think all of us here are really, really understanding and empathizing and feeling it when you say this, especially in today's age and time and current geopolitical situation being so difficult. Culture is, I think, our mission, and I think our shared mission in this case. So the more, the better. The more institution, the more people, the more actors, the more mediators, the more facilitators we have, the more our voices can be heard, and we can help culture to be a more recognized part of our society, as it should be. So with this, I think we will move to our presentations. For today, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers, and I would like to start with Jason Vitorillo. Hi, Jason. Jason is originally from the Philippines, but based in Singapore. He's an educator with 15 years of experience in planning and designing arts and cultural management curricula in higher education. He's currently a lecturer at La Salle College of the Arts here in Singapore, and he will kind of introduce a bit what are the frameworks in place and what are the policies in place that can help the sector from a more regional perspective. We also have with us today Rama Taharani. Rama is the director of Kelola Foundation in Indonesia, an independent non-for-profit organization dedicated to supporting the growth and sustainability of Indonesia's performing arts sector. She's a performing arts producer working across different areas of the performing arts. And then we have also with us Lim Mingyi. Hi, Mingyi. Mingyi is an artist, an outreach manager at Siongleng Musical Association, based here in Singapore, specializing in traditional Nanning music. She's a performer. She's performed internationally, and today she will talk from the perspective of an artist, but also from the perspective of a musical ensemble that has to preserve the tradition and the heritage while at the same time thrive in a contemporary world. So without further ado, I would like to start by giving the floor to Jason. Each one of you will have 20 minutes to do your presentation, and then we'll have some Q&As. Jason, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Valentina. Okay. All right. I believe everyone
Yes, we
can
can
see my
see you.
slides. Okay, great. All right. Let me begin first with a good afternoon. Magandang hapon, maayong hapon in Filipino and in my mother tongue. Thank you for inviting me, Valentina and ASEF and UNESCO Jakarta to this webinar and this discussion. And I'd like to frame my sharing this afternoon with the title of Going Beyond Preservation, looking into the structural sustainability and the living artist. Okay? As we look into policies, management approaches, and education as an initiative, as a way to find and then recognize the value of living artists. From here, then, hold on. Okay, let me introduce the 3 points, the 3 key points with provocations and frameworks that I'm going to present today by understanding first the myth of the static archive. And then what do I mean by this? This simply means that when we look at traditional performing arts, even with or in spite of all the developments and work towards it, it is still very much prevalent that we romanticize traditional arts as something of a relic that needs to be preserved. And I also want to challenge that notion and concept of cultural preservation. I'll talk more about that in a while. However, the reality presented to us, if we examine what the landscape of the performing arts, mostly specifically the traditional performing arts, whether in Asia and in Europe, is that there is already a transition, and transitions have been moving quite constantly. We see a lot of shifts in how traditional performing arts are being practiced, how they are being grounded. But what is, and within that, we see the issue and the problem of how a lot of these traditional performing arts that are community-based rituals or practices are often and increasingly being pressured by developments, urbanization, demographic changes, the loss of ancestral land, and more recently, as we look into concepts of cultural economics and creative economy, the precariousness of the working conditions of artists. As a former practitioner, being my background is in theater, I'm also challenging myself to move away with this romantic idea of cultural preservation, understanding that these practices cannot simply be seen as an artifact, a relic, a static museum piece, right? Because the fact is, heritage is lived. We all live it. It's part of what we experience, what we go through, what we embody every day. It's not fixed. It's constantly moving. It's constantly evolving. However, it only remains viable when it is actively practiced, transmitted, and reimagined in new ways of experiencing it against the constant changes in contemporary life. Okay. Thus, I argue and I push for the argument that perhaps it is time to move beyond the museum model of cultural preservation, which seeks to freeze the art form for what it traditionally is, but to reimagine cultural development and see it more as an ecosystem model where sustainability is defined by protecting, safeguarding ensuring the welfare of the artist, the practitioner, because what they do, ultimately, their practice would have relevance to the very community or communities that they serve. Okay, and by thinking of it more as an ecosystem model, that approach, we're looking at how their practices can remain and constantly remain relevant even within the conversations of modern cultural economy. Okay, from here, this leads me then to the first key point I'd like to emphasize and to raise the question. And perhaps the first hurdle is to understand how we innovate and that concept of innovation. How do we innovate without losing the soul of the practice? Here I bring a scholarly framing of the theory of cultural evolution, which, if we look at it in its simplest definition, we can define traditional arts, or we can say that traditional arts remain viable only when they are constantly, continuously being practiced, shared, transmitted, and reimagined in many possible ways. However, there is also a danger when it comes to that, right? The way it is being reimagined. That's why when we think of innovation, though automatically what would come to mind is to move into digital platforms, more hybrid practices, I rather push for the idea that to think of innovating traditional art, performing arts practices, is to look into mechanisms that allows it to survive and allows it also to resist certain things that damages that very culture. And platforms, avenues, ways for it to become more visible, to increase its visibility. Okay. Within this conversation, right? And as I speak about strategically reimagining the practice, there are many ways of going about it. We can go through collaborations, interdisciplinarity collaborations, a mixing of certain practices and performances. Could be through festivals, for example, the digitalization of it, or by staging these performances in site-specific or site-responsive formats. Regardless of how we reimagine the practice, I argue that the emphasis really here is how do we, in that practice, build mechanisms for tradition to circulate and generate value in different contexts, in more modern contexts, to understand the loss of traditional community spaces caused by urbanization and development, and how that is addressed by these reimaginations, and to safeguard and maintain access to culture. And by doing so, we're encouraging and creating opportunities for social bonding. Okay. With this, then, I'd like to raise the first provocation question, if you may, if I may, right? And this is to ask that if we use technology, for example, when we think of innovation, automatically think of, oh, we're going to use emerging technologies and all of that. Or as we explore new formats, are we using these elements, these technology, these new formats as a way to hide the tradition? Or are we amplifying the original intent, the core of the artistic work, the culture, the belief, for our new audience as we use these elements? Where are we in terms of how we think about the practice, right? I'll pause it there in terms of the very first key point, okay? I'll move now, in the interest of time, to the second key point, which is to look into, to examine the political economy of the artist, okay? First and foremost, we cannot talk about sustainability of any art form, right, if we do not talk about the sustainability and welfare of the human being performing it, the very artist that creates it. Sustainability, therefore, is undermined by limiting access for growth, for development, for any artist for that matter. Okay. It was shared earlier where global crisis, for example, and just about any external factors or any external events would have serious implication on the work of artists. Okay, thus it brings us to the idea that in order for artists to thrive, we must look into how we can create conditions, how can we create the environment, the ecosystem for artists to continue to express their talents, their works. This could be approached in two prongs through policies, cultural policies, as well as in education. And I'll speak more about those 2 points as we move forward. Okay, when we talk then about policy, it's a must then for policy to shift towards structural labor reforms that treat traditional performing artists, as professional workers, as professional artists. Okay, and to be mindful of how we simply use contemporary cultural economic principles and discourse to fit traditional artists, performing artists within that world. Okay. Further on this thought is to ensure fair social and economic conditions, and not to simply see them as perks that we give to artists. Okay, we have to understand, and I have to push for this point, that in order to work and build this ecosystem that gives artists an environment for them to thrive, right? Is to ensure that their basic needs are provided. They are protected. The diversity of culture is protected. The many narratives and voices are protected and allowed to be visible and heard. And the ability and the knowledge of artists is transferred, is shared, is transmitted, to not just fellow artists, not just the younger generations, but to as many communities or audiences who, with an understanding of their work, appreciation and valuing of their work and of them as artists can grow, right? And this ensures those conditions, social or economic conditions, that would greatly benefit artists. Central to this is, without all of these things, artistic freedom is compromised, or artistic freedom is endangered or challenged. The second question I'd like to raise here then is that if we think of art forms, traditional art forms, and how precarious the creation of that and the state of the artists on that, is that then a failing of the very art form, that it cannot move beyond the traditions, the history of it that binds it to the ground, so to speak, right? Is it then a failing of the very art form itself? And therefore, when we look into economic discourses, it's to transform that into a product that is marketable, that is sold. There's a great push on thinking entrepreneurship approaches to the arts, including traditional art forms. But I'd like to challenge that by raising the point that perhaps it's not a failing of that. It's instead the failing of the economic structures that surrounds it. Okay, and I'll leave you with that second key point. And my last key point is on arts leadership, ethical considerations, ethical interculturalism, and representation. Okay, as traditional arts enter global markets, and there's a need to collaborate with contemporary sectors, there is a very clear risk of exploitation and misrepresentation experienced by and can potentially be experienced by traditional artists. Okay, what is important here then is for us to ask, how can we create meaningful collaborations where we essentially focus on knowledge exchange networks? And I emphasize the word exchange here, and to see these traditional artists as part of that exchange and not simply being treated as a source of inquiry for others. Let's say, for example, contemporary artists inquiring about their work in order for contemporary artists to adapt it into something quite different. This entails focusing on skills development, capacity building for artists, and by doing so, it allows artists to really engage in more meaningful exchanges without compromising their artistic integrity. Artists therefore enter this global market, and as we think of bringing them into that, we need to think of them as co-creators rather than as cultural resources and merely as that. Okay, so a lot of the points I've shared so far here challenges existing notions and thoughts that we have on these points. Let me then end my sharing today with the thought that if we think of collaborations as a way to transmit or expand the transmission of cultural expressions, the work of traditional performing artists, how are we seeing them and how are we treating them? Are they agents? Are they part of the co-creation process? Are they part of making decisions? Or are they simply add-ons in a way to kind of add a flavor onto a cultural project or any project for that matter? I'd also like to push the point that tourism and the way we have been working on tourism, the policies for tourism may also allow a lot of exploitations on traditional artists and their communities. Thus, I'd like to argue perhaps we need to examine how we can decouple or detach funding from the tourism argument. And lastly, as a concrete example to show what can be done here and sustainably work towards ensuring the welfare, well-being of artists, both social and economic, is to go back to education and to look at alternative ways of educating communities, audiences, consumers, the youth, the next generation, about these artistic, creative, cultural expressions, because once people have an understanding of what these are, appreciation can grow and valuing can be really worked towards on. Okay, so in the Philippines, for example, there's the schools of living traditions. It's a non-formal approach to transmitting knowledge from cultural masters or cultural experts to younger generations. What is key here is the Philippine government, through the help of the Department of Education, is also looking at further institutionalizing it and bringing it to the primary education and secondary education curriculum in the Philippines. So it's not only the transmission of knowledge is not only within the very cultural communities themselves. Okay, I've already said quite a lot, but I hope all of these would be provocations and thoughts for us to examine and to reflect within our practice. I will turn over the floor to my fellow speakers. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat, dagang salamat.
Thank you very much, Jason, for setting this very interesting initial context. I think a lot of points that we can reflect on. And I think with the presentation now from Rama, we will probably already go into practical ways in which we can make things happen and support the sector and sort of address the challenges that you were also mentioning in your presentation. So I would like to give the floor to Rama now and see how we can connect what Jason mentioned so far to what is happening specifically, I think, with the context of Indonesia. Rama, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon again, everyone. Mrs. Ambassador, wonderful team of ASEF and UNESCO, fellow speakers, and all esteemed guests. Thank you, Jason, for the inspiring knowledge and provocations. Later on in my sharing, we can find some keywords that echo what you have just shared. It is titled, What Allows Practice to Continue? Rethinking Sustainability Beyond Preservation. We often speak about preserving traditional performing arts. But from what we observe in practice, preservation alone is rarely the issue. Sustainability is. In many of the contexts we work in, artists are not only navigating questions of identity or innovation, but also very practical concern. Time, income, access to networks, and the ability to continue working. So for me, the question is not only how contemporary practices can draw from tradition, but what kind of conditions and connections are needed for these practices to move forward. I come to this conversation from my work with an organization called Kelola. Kelola has been working in the arts and cultural sector in Indonesia for more than 2 decades, particularly in supporting artists and cultural practitioners through grants and capacity development. In its earlier phase, Kelola functioned largely as an intermediary, connecting artists with resources and opportunities. This position, however, is not always straightforward in practice. It often means working between different layers of the ecosystem, between artists, institutions, and sometimes government frameworks. This means that part of our work is to translate, not only translating the needs from the field into programs, but also policy frameworks into practices that are meaningful and accessible on the ground. At the same time, we also carry the responsibility to bring back the realities of artistic practice into these broader conversations. Over time, we began to rethink our role. We started asking, is access to resources enough? Or do we need to engage more closely with how artistic practices are actually developed and sustained? This question changed how we work, from providing grants to offering accompaniment, from focusing on individual processes to exchange and collective processes, and from working primarily on the artistic side of the ecosystem to also thinking about visibility and public accessibility. And today, this shift is reflected in how we structure our work. We focus on two main areas. First, how works are produced and distributed, not only supporting artistic creation, but also working with artists and producers to think about context, audiences, and circulation. And importantly, about different forms of partnership that can support both production and circulation. Second, how artistic practices connect with audiences, particularly those that are not always visible or easily accessible. Because for us, sustainability is not about supporting artists, but about nurturing the conditions in which their work can be encountered. This focus is grounded in a recurring gap we have observed in the ecosystem. Strong artistic ideas often struggle to find their way into sustainable forms of practice and circulation. Across the archipelago, artistic labs have grown significantly, supporting many emerging artists. But only a few of the artists are able to sustain their practice beyond their initial development phase. This is where we see the role of producers becomes critical, alongside curators, cultural managers, as key actors in the ecosystem. Their role goes beyond supporting artistic production. They mediate between practices, context, and audiences. Yet, their role remains largely under-recognized, and the structures to support them are still limited. One of the ways we began to respond was by initiating, together with the Jakarta Arts Council, the Jejaring Produser Pertunjukan Indonesia, or an Indonesian Producers Network. It is a peer-based forum where producers meet regularly to exchange practices, reflect on shared challenges, and engage with both local and global discourses. The network is intentionally kept fluid and informal so it can respond to the evolving needs of practitioners on the ground. At the same time, this also pushed us to rethink how artistic development itself could be supported. This is where we began to approach artistic development through a producing lens. By producing, I do not mean logistics or management alone. We see producing as a critical practice, one that mediates between artistic intention and its wider context, translates embodied or situated knowledge into different formats and platforms, and designs the conditions through which a work can continue to live beyond its initial creation. In this sense, producing is not what comes after creation, it is what allows creation to continue living. This perspective did not just shape how we think, it became central in how we design our programs. An incubation platform where we paired artists and producers to develop projects together over time. Rather than simply producing new works, we began to understand it as a peer-based laboratory where different ways of practicing art, including those shaped by tradition, are negotiated, translated, and sometimes contested. Let me briefly share what this looks like. In practical terms, in the incubation, we do not only support the creation of work, but also work closely with artist-producer pairs on questions such as, what kind of shift or innovation is actually happening in the work? Who is this work for? Does it speak to the audience it wants to reach? Where can it exist beyond its initial presentation? What kind of partnerships are needed to support it? And how can the process itself be sustained over time? These questions may seem practical, but they often lead to deeper reflections on the work itself, its form, its duration, and its relationship to context. I'm going to give you an example. This is a work developed by one artist-producer pair from Mulawali Institute, a Bali-based artist collective. The Voices After Chat is a dance theater performance that approaches kecak, a Balinese form, not as a fixed traditional practice, but as an experience of vibration. This notion of vibration is explored not only through movement and choreography, but also as a way of thinking about contemporary social dynamics and forms of collective gathering. Within this creative process, vibration becomes a point of dialogue, linking embodied practice with shifting social contexts and the ways communities come together today. Even within a single work, we begin to see how different practices intersect, drawing from embodied forms while also engaging with new contexts and technologies. It becomes difficult to define it within fixed categories, such as traditional or contemporary. Back to the design. In this incubation platform, artist-producer pairs are supported through mentoring and a series of peer-to-peer dialogues, where they develop not only their artistic ideas, but also how these ideas are communicated, situated, and carried forward. Each pair works within their own local context, shaped by different embodied or situated practices. This means that the dialogues are not only exchanges between individuals, but also across localities, where different ways of practicing art encounter one another. Within this process, each pair receives a limited seed funding, not to complete the work, but to initiate a process that requires them to seek out relationships, partnerships, and further support. As the work begins to take form, the process is open to observers and writers, so that the works are not only presented, but also critically engaged and reflected upon. These reflections are then brought back into collective discussion, creating another layer of dialogue within the process. The writings are also made publicly accessible as part of our effort to build visibility and public literacy. At certain moments, we also invite presenters, such as festival directors, to enter the space, allowing the pairs to articulate their work outward and explore its possibilities for circulation. By design, what we were interested in was not simply how new works are created, but what happens when different practices, each shaped by their own contexts and localities, are brought into relation with one another. What emerges is not a single trajectory, but a field of practices where ideas, approaches, and ways of working encounter, influence, and sometimes challenge each other. And within this field, the producing process becomes a way of holding these relations, asking questions of context, audience, and circulation, while opening up possibilities for sustainability and partnership. In this sense, the incubation is not only about producing works, but about sustaining practices through exchange, through relation, and through the conditions that allow them to continue. And this is where we begin to see that what sustains a practice is not only the work itself, because in many cases, sustainability does not depend on a single work, but on the networks and relationships that allow that work to continue to exist, to circulate, and to evolve over time. What this also reveals are some of the gaps in the working conditions within the ecosystem. Limited long-term funding, short-term project timelines, and a lack of structured support for professional development, particularly for roles such as producers and cultural mediators. Intermediary organizations like ours try to respond to these gaps, not only by providing resources and opportunities, but by designing the processes that allow for continuity, reflection, and exchange. What we observed was not a smooth process of collaboration, but one that required constant negotiation between artistic intention, production realities, and different ways of working. From this experience, I would like to share 3 observations that may help us to think about how the sector could move forward. First, we realize that translation is not a neutral process. In many cases, producers are involved in translating how a work is communicated, framed, and encountered so that it can be presented, accessed by wider publics, supported, or circulated across contexts. But not everything can or should be translated so easily. Certain elements resist simplification. And in those moments, the question becomes, what gets foregrounded, what gets left out, and who gets to decide? This also brought up questions of partnership, not only who is involved in making the work, but who continues to support and carry it forward afterwards. Following this, the second one, time itself became a site of negotiation. Different artistic practices, including those rooted in embodied or traditional forms, require a different sense of time, one that is not always compatible with project timelines, deadlines, or production cycles. Within the incubation, this created tension between efficiency and depth, and it revealed how working conditions, something we often considered external, actually shape what kind of artistic processes are possible. And finally, the third one, we learned that meaningful collaboration does not happen automatically. It needs to be carefully structured. In our case, the relationship between artists and producers was built as a partnership where both contribute different forms of knowledge and expertise. While our platform does not directly engage with traditional artists in this pairing, we are aware that in many contexts, collaborations between contemporary and traditional practitioners can risk becoming superficial or extractive. This is why we believe that how collaboration is designed, including questions of time, dialogue, and shared responsibility, becomes crucial, especially when engaging with practices connected to heritage. In that sense, we see this kind of incubation as building the groundwork, not only for artistic development, but also for more responsible forms of collaboration across different practices. Through this process, we begin to understand that producing is not only about enabling creation, but about shaping the conditions under which cultural practices, including those connected to heritage, can be meaningfully sustained and reimagined. Sustaining artistic practices, then, is not only a question of preservation or innovation, but of conditions that allow artists to work, to reflect, and to collaborate, and also to build relationships that support their practice over time. In this sense, heritage is not something that exists independently of these conditions. It lives through practice, And practice depends not only on creation, but on how it is connected to wider ecosystems of support. This includes the partnerships that enable works to be produced, shared, and sustained. And this is where we see the role of producing as critical, not only as a support function, but as a way of shaping how artistic works connects to audiences, to contexts, and to networks that allow it to continue living. And from this perspective, how we categorize these practices becomes less important than how they are sustained. In many of the practices we encounter, the distinction between traditional and contemporary is not something fixed. Artists move between them, drawing from tradition, reworking it, or sometimes questioning it altogether. What becomes important then is not the category itself, but conditions that allow these practices to remain alive, relevant, and connected. So perhaps the question is not only how contemporary artists can engage with tradition, but also what kinds of structures, relationships, and partnerships we need to build around them to make that engagement meaningful and sustainable. Because ultimately, the future of these practices does not depend only on artists, but on how we collectively choose to support the conditions and connections in which they can continue to live, to evolve, and remain meaningful across generations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rama. This is really interesting, and I think it also kind of reinforces what Jason was saying before. And I think the more I listen to this, the more it looks like this idea of categorizing traditional performing arts versus contemporary performing arts is probably not really what is important, but as you said, is really to create the conditions and the environment for any artist working in the performing arts to be able to thrive and work. I think the third speaker will be the perfect example, I think, in my opinion, because I know a little bit about Xionglang and I had the pleasure of collaborating with them already 2 years ago. Really a successful example of how a very traditional art form is actually able to really thrive and collaborate and really work in a bigger ecosystem that is not just simply the one of the music ensemble. With this very short introduction, I would like to give the floor now to Mingyi to talk about Xionglang and about the work that you guys are doing in Singapore and in the region. Sorry, Mingli, the floor is yours. Yes.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Let me just share my screen. All right. All right. A very good evening, a very good afternoon to the ambassador and, people from UNESCO, from ASEF, fellow speakers and attendees. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Ming Yi, and I'm the Outreach Manager and Principal Artist with Xiongling Musical Association. And today I'll be speaking a little bit about how Xiongling navigates as an organization this idea of tradition in transition, how we try to remain relevant in today's society, particularly in Singapore, and how we continuously experiment across forms and different genres. A little bit about Xiongling. We were established in 1941 and we promote, preserve, and develop a traditional Chinese art form called Nanin, which I will explain a little bit about later on as well. So a key turning point for us was in the 1970s when the late Mr. Teng Ma Sing became our chairman. So he was very passionate about Nanin and spent a big half of his life revolutionizing and revitalizing the art form. So he really laid the foundation for us for being innovative and to give us the courage to experiment with different forms. And so our company is also very lucky to have had the support of the National Arts Council, and we are a major arts company since 2012. So of course, our mission is to create sounds and productions that are uniquely Singapore and to produce exceptional Nanin works. And our vision is to be the model of advocacy and growth for traditional Chinese music and to champion the Nanin landscape, not just in Singapore, but also in the region. So what exactly is Nanin? Just a short history lesson. Nanin is a traditional Chinese art form with its roots tracing back to the Han Dynasty, which is about 2,000 years ago. So hearsay, because a lot of this is not formally documented, hearsay, it was a form of palace music, all right, but it is now a form of folk music. And you may be able to find Nanin in places that you can find people speaking the Minnan dialect or of the Minnan descent. Because of its long history, it was actually recognized by UNESCO in 2009 as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So the form is highly distinctive. It only has 4 main instruments, which you can see here. I will show it to you in greater detail later as well. We have 2 pizzicato or stringed instruments, one being the pipa, which is a 4-stringed lute, one being the sanxian, which is a 3-stringed lute, one being the dongxiao. It's a melodic instrument. It's a vertically held bamboo flute. And the last one being the erxian, which is a 2-stringed fiddle. So a lot of people have asked how something so traditional and from China came over to Singapore. So of course, there were many, many early migrants from the Fujian province that traveled to Southeast Asia, not just Singapore. And together with the people, a part of their culture was brought over as well. And this is their instruments and their music. So at the beginning, here say that it was more for their own purposes. They gathered in small groups to perform for festivities or whenever they missed home. And slowly, as clan associations opened, or what we call 会馆, they started forming bigger groups to put up performances for these clan associations. And then also they can earn a little bit of pocket money through these performances for festivities and events as well. And so, of course, with these Nanin troops or Nanin ensembles formed in Singapore, Nanin has also been able to evolve in relation to Singapore's landscape. And now, actually, Xiongling is recognized for creating sounds or Nanin that is uniquely Singapore, or what we can only hear in Singapore. All right, this is a traditional Nanin performance setup. As you can see, there are 5 musicians, the middle one being the vocals, all right, the vocalist, and then we have the pipa player, the sanxian player, the dongxiao player, and lastly, the erxian player. So you can see there's minimal set, minimal lighting. And so for a traditional performance, what really to focus on is its tonality, its sound, its nuances, which is not easily appreciated by people who do not know the form. And for beginners who have not heard Nanin before, when they hear it, a lot of people have told me, I fell asleep by the second sentence. It's very slow, all right? It's very free in its structure, okay? And so from the early 2010s, Xiongling has been constantly trying to attract youths to inherit the form, because we know that the youths are the next generation. And so what we've been trying to do, broadening our audience base, has all been proven very difficult, because we are in a world where everything is very easily accessible and there's so much to see and learn online. And Nanin is a very niche and traditional form. And sometimes, like many other traditional forms, it gets eaten up and pushed aside. And on another form, in terms of education for us as an organization, because Nanin is sung in the Minnan dialect, so we make use of a dialect, it is hard for us to go into deeper learning in formal institutions like MOE schools. Now it is getting better, but in the early 2010s, when we were really needing it, we were not able to go into deeper learning. It was very surface. But however, we work closely with art schools in Singapore, such as NAFA and SOTA, and some of our core artists today are actually from those schools. So, apart from education programs, the other way that we try to attract youths and to garner new audiences is through our programming. And this is the biggest component of what we've been trying to do. I think one of the very powerful qualities of traditional art, or people in the traditional arts, is the ability to adapt it based on the place that they are in. So the Nanin that you hear in Singapore and the Nanyin that you hear back in China is really totally different. It will not be the same. And in Singapore, we are in a very unique position. We exist within a multicultural, highly connected environment, and there's a lot of resources and genres and different forms for us to tap into. And so at Xiongling, we respond to this by creating works that are in these three forms. The first one being multicultural, the second one being multidisciplinary, and the last one being multifaceted. So by multicultural, that's very straightforward. So we try to work with the different cultures that we have here in Singapore, the different forms. All right. And through this, we are not just creating dialogues between Nanyin and other musical forms, but also reflecting Singapore's identity and Singapore's multicultural society. And by multidisciplinary, this is also very self-explanatory. We bring together different types of art forms. So not just music and music, we merge music with dance, we've done music with theater, we've done music with visual arts. And all this is to expand how our traditional art form, or for us, Nanyin, can be presented and experienced on a bigger stage. And lastly, multifaceted, meaning we don't consider our productions just as a particular concert, but rather how do we view and experience the performance as a whole by including, sound design, lighting design, staging design, costumes, very importantly, adds on to the experience that people get when they watch a performance. So creating an immersive experience that not just engages the ears, but also the eyes and the imagination of what imagery we're trying to evoke. So all this is, of course, part of our effort to remain relevant and to make Nanyin more accessible. So to create a bridge between something very foreign, which is tradition, and something that is more modern and contemporary, which people can appreciate and people can tap into. So maybe I will also go a little bit into how we process our productions. So firstly, for a very typical production, we begin identifying firstly, of course, the form or the genre that we want to engage with. And this is a very collaborative process because we're an organization, our producers, artistic directors are usually from our company, and us as principal artists, we also have a say in, what we want to work with. So once we find a form that we wish to work with, then our music director comes in, and his role is actually very important in bridging the two different forms together. So our music director is also our arranger, composer. He does everything. He studies the chosen form in very much detail. He has a lot of workshops together with us as principal artists and also the other form to make sure we find a shared musical trait, a common tune, a tonality, to kind of bridge the two together. So in the past, a lot of people would ask us, so, how much Nanyin is in your work and how much of the other forms are in your work? And we would give a very scientific answer. We would say, oh, our work has 60% Nanyin and 40% other forms. But as we go on and as we experience these collaborations, it's actually very difficult to quantify. I mean, how much of Nanyin we retain and how much of the other form we merge into our form, or how much Nanyin is merged into theirs. And I think what matters more is whether or not the integration for us as artists feel authentic and whether we feel comfortable in performing it together on stage with the other artists. All right, so once the composition is developed, we move into rehearsals. And once the compositions are done, 80% of the work is really done. In the rehearsals, we go through score reading, and then we go through what we can do, what we cannot do as artists, what we wish to improve on, what can be changed to make it better. All these are very collaborative processes. But the biggest challenge I realized over our many collaborative performances and productions is that Nanyin does not follow a fixed tempo. There's no conductor. So when we have 4 instruments, the pacing is primarily led by the pipa player, which is the 4-string flute. And one day, although there's a structure as to how you should play it, a pipa player can play this song in a certain way today, but tomorrow can play it in another way. There are subtle changes in the way that he or she plays it and expresses it, depending on their mood. And so this becomes particularly challenging for someone who's not in Nanyin or is performing with us from another form. So what we have done now to kind of counter this situation, and very tastefully done by our music director, is to incorporate click tracks and in-ear monitors. And through this, we've also gotten questions saying, how can you use a click track for traditional form? The beauty of Nanyin is in its freeness, in its freedom for expression and its slowness. So why do you guys use click tracks? And what our music director has done is, when he decides to make a composition, he actually gets the traditional Nanyin recording first. So we choose the materials and we give him the materials. And what he does with this traditional material is map it and program it using a program to map out the click as according to the traditional form. So actually, when we are performing it, yes, we are listening to a click track, but what the audiences hear is actually almost exactly the same as it would be performed traditionally. So that is one of the best ways that we found out works for us for multicultural works or multidisciplinary works, in a way that everybody can come together through listening to the click track, and it still feels traditional. It still sounds like traditional Nanyin. All right. So let me just share a little bit more about the works that we have done. This program is called Origin Cypher. It was co-produced with Esplanade, and was produced at the performed at the Esplanade Concert Hall. It is a collaboration with traditional South Korean music. So this production was very special because it brought together 3 types of intangible cultural heritage. The first one being Nanyin, the second one being pansori, which is a Korean, musical storytelling, and the last one being the Haenyeo culture, which is the female divers from Jeju. So as you can see, we made use of projection to evoke certain type of imagery. Every time we do a performance, it's very important for us to give the audiences an emotion, to evoke an emotion or an image, all right, pertaining to what we are performing, all right? And so if you can see, other than the instruments, the text, and everything, one very important thing about this performance is how we incorporated the costumes. And I would like to touch on that because the costumes were very carefully designed to reflect both Chinese and Korean traditions, although not an exact mirror, all right? But it has elements of the 2 different types of traditional costumes. And although we are fundamentally different, our costume designer actually tried to make us seem as if we are one group through shared textures of the cloth, the motifs, and of course the cape and the skirt. They are actually weaved with flowers and leaves, just showing that we are one team. So this kind of blurs, the lines very clearly between we are Nanyin, she is South Korean traditional music. And this is the way that we blur it. And not just from there, but also the music that's being composed, how we find a balance between the 2. The second work that I would like to talk about is titled Silence of All Things. And this was directed by the brilliant Mr. Liu Xiaoyi. And this production was deeply experimental, very abstract, and some people would say avant-garde. And for me personally, as an artist, this was an extremely challenging production. So Nanyin is actually an art form that really, really drives on the chemistry and the intuition and understanding between 5 of the musicians, the vocalists and 4 instruments. Like what I said, there's no conductors. So from the very beginning, it has been driven into us that we have to spend more time together, we have to practice more together, so that we have this chemistry and understanding of each other. And so after understanding this, Mr. Liu actually decided to break us up into 5 different segments, each of us holding 1 segment. So the 4 instruments had their own segments and the vocals had her own segment. And this allowed the uniqueness of each, instrument and voice to emerge. But this process was very much different from the other shows that we have done. So instead of structured rehearsals, we went through weeks of exploratory workshops, and it was quite intensive. So, Mr. Liu would give us prompts, will ask us questions, play us different types of genres of music, and make us perform in that environment and in that situation. So it was a lot about responding to his prompts and reflecting on our identities as not just artists in the form, but our form itself. And we were constantly adapting. Every day was different. Every day we had to do something different. And for me, as a Nanayan artist, I am very, very used to structure. I'm not used to being, improvisation. And so going through this, it was very difficult for me to come up with something new every day. But after the show was over and I did some reflection on my own, I realized that this allowed me more, and of my artistic voice. I could voice in my own way, better understand myself, my form, and also better understand myself as a performer and the form in how I embody it. So my identity. And so I think this work, it really juxtaposed traditional Nanayan with elements like electronic pop music, contemporary dance. We also were very, very, very honored to work with one of Indonesia's renowned traditional dancers, Maestro Didik. All right, he also was part of the performance. And I think through this production, for me, it was really exploring the idea that tradition can remain constant even within noise, within disruption, and within change. And also for this show, we were very, 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 very concerned about how certain audiences would receive it, how certain audiences would react to it. But very heartwarmingly and very encouragingly, a lot of them enjoyed it. And so I think through this experimentation and through this production, we realized that a lot of our audiences are willing to engage deeper with more abstract ideas. And I do have a short video for this show, but there is a jump scare, so please turn down your volume. Okay. So again, the use of projection is very prevalent in all of our shows. All right, so just a very short snippet of that show. The last example I'd like to bring in very quickly is Tempest and Tranquility. So this was a collaboration between Nanayan and South Indian classical music, all right, and traditional Indian dance as well. So this one was also particularly challenging because we know that the sounds of Nanayan is very slow and very mellow, whereas the Southern Indian classical music can be very upbeat and intense. So finding a point to converge required significant negotiations between, for our music director and also between our artists. So interestingly, this was how it was staged. So through also projection stage design and also our costumes, as you can see, we tried to blur the distinctiveness of the two forms, all right? Rather than presenting them again as two different forms, we usually like to present them as one whole, right? And we also use props that were not distinctive of any culture or of any form. This work has also actually represented Singapore in Gwangju, South Korea for the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic ties between South Korea and Singapore, and will be touring Shanghai and Beijing in September. So this work has reflected well, I think, and also merged well the two different types of forms, and has been particularly popular after we have performed it. So I'll leave you with a short snippet as well. So sorry, my time is up, but very quickly wrapping up. So returning to the theme of tradition in transition, at Xiongling, we actively experiment, but knowing that not every attempt will succeed. But through experimentation, we can create new entry points for not just our artists and not just the different forms, but for our audiences who may find traditional forms distant or unfamiliar. So perhaps most importantly, what we need to think about is how we allow the tradition itself to evolve, not by losing its essence, but also allowing it to respond to the world that it lives in today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mingyi. This was really interesting, and I think it really gave a nice closure to this topic from three very different perspectives. We have quite a number of questions. I'm trying to select a few because we don't have a lot of time. Maybe one question that could be, I think it was for Rama, but I think it's a question that could apply to the three of you if you would like to answer it. How can producers and artists work together to avoid cultural misinterpretation while sustaining the integrity of traditional performing arts? And I think the three of you have talked about this. So maybe if you want to take this question, maybe Rama first.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I might say that in any performing art works, one of key aspects of the early development of performing artwork is artistic research. So it consists not only desk research, but also meeting and interviewing living resources such as maestro, for instance. And then in later part of the development, when it comes to translation or adaptation, we learn from experience from the incubation that not everything needs to be translated or adapted. So part of the producing process is also recognizing limits. That's important. What should remain as it is and what can be recontextualized. So rather than forcing accessibility or circulation, we try to create space for dialogue, and this is the key word, I think, the space for dialogue and negotiation where these decisions are made consciously together.
Thank you, Rama. Jason?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Rama said. In the work that I have done and the research that I have done as well, it's important to understand what is the relationship between the stakeholders and what powers do they hold in the negotiation, and what's the dynamic of that. Because in any collaboration, if we don't examine the power dynamics, then what truly gets to be considered and heard and negotiated or renegotiated could be imbalanced. And having said that, then how we can move forward in order to maintain the integrity of the work of the artist is to start talking about ethical integrations and ethical considerations. And then that may run across how it impacts or affects the culture of the work that is being appropriated or rethought or reimagined or experimented on, to who owns the rights for those. The intellectual property discourse should be seriously be part of that negotiation. I second what Rama said about the importance of research, because if we look at traditional cultures, there's a point where we can, from a scholarly view, categorize what is open versus closed practices and traditions, and we allow we open ourselves to negotiation, experimentation, reimagination when it comes to the open traditions and practices, but we safeguard very tightly the closed ones, because of the adverse impact on them if we do put them into that contemporary sphere. Yeah.
But I was just wondering, related to what you're just saying now, what about Nanning? Because from my perspective, when I first approached Nanning, it looked like a closed kind of art form that needs to be protected. But then what you were sharing with us, Minnie, seems to be actually going into, opening up and creating more collaboration space. What is your thought about this?
Well, of course, in our organization, we focus a lot on experimentation and collaboration with others. So that is a very important part of our work because we feel like without these experimentations and collaborations, then Nanin itself remains stagnant. And although remaining stagnant may not be a bad thing, tradition is there for a reason, it's there for a purpose. And I believe that Nanin has survived so many years because it is truly something that is appreciated and is beautiful. And so, in our view, we are trying to make it more accessible, in a sense, to the people of Singapore or the people internationally, to make it like a doorstep into the world of Nanin as a traditional art form. So this is like a teaser. This is what Nanin can do. But as you go deeper, actually, we do a lot of traditional performances as well that follow the traditional cultures and the lineage of what Nanin should be. And then for people who have watched a lot of our performances and they understand the form as it is, then they will be able to appreciate Nanin as it is. What we realize now is a lot of audiences, they don't know how to appreciate Nanin. They don't know what the context of Nanin is. And so through these collaborations that we have with others, it is a way for other cultures to find out about us, other audiences, new audiences to find out about us, slowly get curious, and then learn more about the form. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. Thanks. And I think, well, as you said, it's great when you can do both. You can do more traditional and more maybe outreach to education, schools, what you were sharing as well, and then also do the part that is more experimental. I have another question, unless maybe Moe has a question. I just wanted to ask you if you had anything you want to know. Okay, then I will move to, yeah, good. Or you want anything you wanted to ask? No, good. So there was another question also that I thought was quite interesting. Let me find. Yes. This was, I think, when Jason was speaking, but again, it could be something for all of you to reflect on. So Ali Mariam is saying, so when we say reimagine cultural practices, does that mean we practice it in multiple different ways? Or should we just adjust some aspect of the practices to keep up with the world updates? Like, can we give us a concrete example for how we can reimagine practice? So I think, Jason, this was meant for you. Maybe you can respond first, and then if any of you wants to add on.
Okay. Well, let me just premise that in my current work right now, I'm no longer practicing. I'm no longer creating art. Okay, so I would defer to Rama and Mingyi on this. But what I can say in response to that question, in terms of thinking of concrete or specific examples of reimagining practices, right? Again, there's a I would see it as a spectrum, right? In several traditional artistic creative expressions or cultural expressions, one can go and focus on the entrepreneurial aspects of it, looking at how these expressions can be put within contemporary industries such as design and fashion, for example. When we speak of, and let me just use an example in the Philippines, when we speak of textile, for example, right? But in terms of performing arts, the pathway could be in the integration into modern artistic expressions. And Mingyi has shown that in her examples shared this afternoon, that it's not just a simple way of saying, oh, we're trying to create a fusion of artistic works or tangible, intangible cultural expressions, right? It's not just the playing on the word of fusion, but really understanding what it means to integrate for both cultures or for both communities having their very own culture. There's a particular case in the Philippines currently wherein a dance company known to be one of the premier dance companies in the Philippines, situated in in Metro Manila, or in Manila, which is the capital city, um, was challenged for how it's appropriated, or how it has appropriated and reimagined the culture of a community in the south of the Philippines. And then those who are living in the south of the Philippines challenged the way their culture was interpreted. And this brings back the difficulties and the challenge for any producer or artist or company to think seriously of when we use, or when we go into the concepts of fusion, um, adaptation, interpretation, because what really is it that we are reimagining here? Okay, so again, I apologize if I couldn't give any specific in terms of an example artwork, but maybe what I can share is some things that we need to be mindful of when we think about reimagining practices. Yeah.
Mingi, Rama, and any of you wants to respond? Rama, yes.
Yeah, thank you. In my case, conducting an incubation for artists and producer to develop new work, I think the answer would be it totally depends on the artistic intention and the perspective chosen to work on the idea. Excuse me. The example in my sharing, in my previous sharing, is the voices after Cha. The artist and producer had the freedom to choose to work on the form or not, or a different perspective. And then at some point, they decided that they want to see Kecha, the quote unquote traditional Balinese form, as a total experience of vibration. So yeah, I think that shortly, I hope answer the question.
Thank you. Mingi, anything you want to add?
Yes, I think I'll add on. I think for us as an organization, when we say we are reimagining a certain form, for me, particularly a form, anything that you think will work, we should try. I think that this is what comes with experimentation, and you never know what works well with what until you try it. And of course, then discussions and research come into play. So you have to discuss with the producers or the artists, what is it that is negotiable and what is non-negotiable in your form and in your practice. And then, of course, moving forward compositions, and it's a long-standing work and a collaborative work that you don't have to compromise yourself or your form in any way for it to become reimagined. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are a bit short on time. As always, there's so many things that we would like to discuss further, but I just want to ask you one last question, which I think is also really interesting, about the stage. Someone is asking, can one of the speakers address or all the question of the stage, as most, if not all, traditional performing arts of Southeast Asia originate from unique natural and architectural stages. I think you were mentioning, Jason, at the beginning also something related to this. Anyone wants to answer this question or a comment on this?
Yeah,
please.
Just go ahead. Before I answer the question directly, I just like to add one more point from the previous discussion, which ties into this question, that when we think of reimagining practices, putting it in more contemporary modern context, I would urge even myself to carefully ensure a certain epistemological care. And what that means is when dealing with traditional practices, we can only reimagine things and adapt it into something, interpret it into something, once we have, at the very least, a reasonable understanding of what it is. The moment that we try to fit something for the sake of having a grand show, that creating the fantastics, that is already a sign that we're destroying something, right? That becomes a very crucial discussion when it comes to space, because a lot of traditional practices and expressions, cultural expressions in the Philippines, when you look at indigenous communities, is very much connected or anchored to ancestral land and traditional spaces. As I've shared earlier, a lot of these, because of development urbanization, have been taken away, or these communities have been displaced. Those spaces cannot be returned to what it is originally. But what I've seen through the work of, or through the initiative of the Schools of Living Traditions, is with the support of government and non-governmental institutions and organizations, local government included, civic and private individuals, is to somehow create sustainable spaces where the community, members of the community, can gather, right? Because it is with the understanding that a lot of these performing arts, or what we would label as performing arts, for them, for these communities, it's not more of a performance in the way we would understand it from a contemporary, urban contemporary arts definition, right? It's not a performance at all. It's very much connected to rituals, cultural practices based on beliefs and based on the growth or the movement of the community in seasons, if you want to put it that way, right? So but what I'm saying here is that there's now this room or this space to rethink about these spaces, and to, from a policy standpoint, what can be created as mechanisms to build these spaces. Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. Anyone else wants to comment on this, Rama? No, Mingy?
Yeah, in a more fundamental perspective, I would see stage as a space of meeting between artists, ideas brought in, and audiences. So when we talk about stage, it is not always in the form of proscenium as what we used to find in the theater building, for instance, but it can be anywhere that best answer the artistic intention. Even it could be in a village where the artistic inspiration comes.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying as well. Okay, I'm afraid we'll have to stop here. We've already used another 15 minutes. And it's been a very interesting conversation. I apologize to all the other participants who asked questions. And I hope there will be another opportunity to maybe, continue this conversation further. I would like to really thank my three speakers today, Jason, Rama, and Mingyee, for really bringing three very nice and very interesting experiences. I think we really showed the best of how traditional and contemporary performing arts can come together, talking about, collaboration and spaces, and being able to enable those collaboration to really flourish. And I hope that this was inspirational and give some food for thought to other people working in this sector, and also to those who are supporting this sector. And from the point of view of ASEF, and I think I can speak also for UNESCO, we we will continue to try and create this conversation to allow people to be exposed, to ask questions, and to, find spaces to exchange ideas. So thank you very much to everyone who participated, to the speakers, to UNESCO, to my colleagues, Karine and Adelina, who are helping today for this conversation. Please continue to look at Culture 360. We send every month information. We will organize more webinars this year, so we hope to see you there. Have a very good evening, everyone, or good afternoon to those who are in Europe. Thank you very much. See you again soon. Bye-bye.